As of where we are in Acts, the 9th chapter, we know that Paul, or Saul, who will better be known as Paul, is now a member of the church. We read of his conversion, of the Lord's encounter with him on the road to Damascus, of his going and meeting Aeneas, and Aeneas telling him what to do. And to his credit, Saul did exactly what he was told. And then Saul remaining there in Damascus, going to Arabia for some time, coming back, and of course meeting opposition from the people he once had been on the side of, and he had to get out of town, being let down by a basket for his own safety. And we are thankful that he came to Jerusalem, and Barnabas took him and alleviated any fears the disciples there had about Saul. He is a genuine Christian. The churches in the area now have rest, and for at least for the time being, all is well. So now in chapter 9, the latter part of the chapter, we return to what man? Peter. We haven't been with Peter actually much since the 5th chapter of Acts. We have pointed out that a lot of people like to outline the book of Acts. One way is with the biography or the works of Peter, chapters 1 to 12. He's the primary person under consideration, though by no means the only. And then 13 to 28 of Acts, the works of Paul. So Peter, chapters 1 to 12, Paul, chapters 13 through 28. Now, there are exceptions, obviously. We haven't met Peter really to any great extent. I know he is mentioned in chapter 8 briefly, but for the most part, since chapter 5, chapters 6 and 7, the focus was on Stephen. Chapter 8, Philip was the main character. The first part of chapter 9, of course, Saul or Paul. And so now in 9:32, we revert back to Peter, and we're going to read tonight of a couple of miracles that he performed. And we hope to finish chapter 9 this evening, 9:32 through 43. The first miracle that Peter will perform, he's going to heal a man, and you can pronounce him as you wish. I'm going to call him Aeneas. And then the second miracle, he will raise Dorcas from the dead. Let's concentrate first on the first, verses 32 through 35. Tanya, if you have that, read for us Acts 9:32 through 35.
Now it came to pass, as Peter went through all parts of the country, that he also came to the saints who dwelt at Lydda. There he found a certain man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden 8 years and was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus the Christ heals you. Arise and make your bed. Then he arose immediately. So all who dwelt at Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord.
Okay, so back up in verse 32, thank you. We find Peter sort of on the move here. Usually we associate the term missionary journey with what man? Paul. But he was not the only one to go on missionary journeys. In fact, Peter's actually on one here. Maybe not nearly as long as some that Paul took. Philip was on a missionary journey in Acts the 8th chapter. He went up north to Samaria. He came back south and converted the eunuch, and then he headed northwest up the coast. And so he did mission work and went on missionary journeys. And that's sort of what Peter is doing here, probably taking advantage of the peace that the churches had in the area. Going back to verse 31, the churches had rest or peace and were edified and were multiplied. You've heard the phrase, strike while the iron is hot. Okay, well, the iron's hot. So Peter's striking. He's going where he can now with the gospel message. You will recall that Peter, of course, was the one who denied the Lord 3 times. You also recall that Jesus appeared to Peter after the resurrection and comforted Peter and also challenged and charged Peter. To look at that, let's go back now to John chapter 21 for a moment. John chapter 21. Angie, if you have that, read verses 15 through 17. John 21, 15 through 17.
So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, Feed my lambs. He said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He said to him, Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, Tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, Do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, Feed my sheep.
Okay, this is after, of course, Jesus was raised from the dead. He appears to the disciples and has sort of a one-on-one here with Simon Peter. The text, or he calls Peter Simon. This is Simon Peter, one of the same. But the charge that Jesus gives to Peter is, I want you to take care of my sheep. Well, you come to Acts chapter 9, that's what Peter is doing. He's fulfilling the command that Jesus had given to him to feed his sheep or to tend his sheep or to take care of his sheep. Because where Peter is going, he is going to where people are already Christians for the most part. Paul is going to go into areas where people are not Christians, but for the most part, at least right now, Peter is going to areas where people are already Christians, tending the sheep of the Lord and caring for the sheep of the Lord. So Peter passes through all quarters or regions or the countryside, and now he came downhill to the saints who lived at Lydda. Saint is simply another word for Christian, okay? Whether it's saint or disciple or Christian, whatever synonym or name you want to use, they're all the same. And so there is a church established in the city of Lydda. Now, Lydda is about 26 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It's located not far from the Mediterranean coast. It's on a plain, so the ground there would be mountainous or flat. Plain is flat, so this is sort of flat land, much like the Delta. Mississippi Delta. Is that mountainous land? George?
Long ways from
Flat as a what?
Flat as a pancake.
Pancake, right? Flat as a pancake. Good cotton growing areas, isn't it? And good mosquito growing areas too, right? That's another story. But anyway, Lydda is going to be in an area of flat, basically flat land. In the Old Testament, the city was called Lod, L-O-D. Lod and Lydda are one and the same. This was a city of the tribe of Benjamin, both before and after the captivity. And for whatever reason, the change was from Lod to Lydda. Sometimes cities change names, right? For whatever reasons. Istanbul, Turkey, was at one time called Byzantium, and then Constantinople. I may have that backwards, but Istanbul has been called a number of different names. New York at first was actually called New Amsterdam. They changed New Amsterdam. It's a whole lot easier to say New York, isn't it, than New Amsterdam. That's not why they changed it, I don't think. But cities change names for whatever reason, and for whatever reason this was Lod. Now it is called Lydda. The Jews actually had control of Lydda. The Romans let the Jews control this area. We're talking about an area under the Roman Empire, but I mean, Rome gave a little bit of leeway to its conquered peoples. I mean, you had enough to do on your plate as it was without just being concerned about every minute detail. So the Romans said to the Jews, if you want to, we'll let you rule Lydda. And they did until the revolt in AD 66. And that's when it said that when the Jews were up in Jerusalem observing the Feast of the Tabernacles, the Romans came and burned Lydda to the ground. So don't rebel against the Romans, I guess was their message there. They rebuilt the city. Today Lydda has a population, it's a modern city, population of about 78,000. So about twice the size of Tupelo population-wise. A little bit bigger than Jackson, Tennessee, not as big as Jackson, Mississippi, but fairly significant city in Palestine, or Israel rather, today. Peter gets there. He does not establish a congregation there, it's already established because saints are already there. And we don't know the origin of who established the church at Lydda. Helped. Could have been Philip on his journey. Could have been saints from Jerusalem who were scattered. In any event, there is a church now, congregation in Lydda. Peter arrives and he finds a certain man named Aeneas. This is a Greek name. This fellow may have been a Hellenistic Jew. We don't know much about him. We don't know really whether or not he was a Christian at the time. He may have been, he may not have been. We just don't know. We're not told. It doesn't matter. Aeneas, I'm reading here from King James, kept his bed 8 years. Goodness, we've kept our bed. We haven't changed beds in 30 years. About time we changed our bed, reckon? What does it mean he kept his bed? He was he was confined to his bedridden. Some translate that, and Tanya may have read bedridden is the idea, for 8 years. Now that implies 8 years earlier he was fine, correct? 8 years earlier he wasn't bedridden. What is his problem? What is Aeneas' problem? He's paralyzed. King James says he was sick of the palsy. That is simply another word for paralyzed. He was not born paralyzed. Some people are born paralyzed. He was not. Something happened to him 8 years earlier that made him paralyzed, and we don't know what happened. How do people become paralyzed? Accident? Car wreck? Disease? We are watching some old shows back home. We have this Pluto TV and everything's free on there, but one show that I enjoyed watching growing up was Rescue 911, William Shatner and so forth, and they reinforce all the time on that program, if you come upon a car wreck and the car's not burning and the person's breathing, the worst thing you can do is what? Move that person. Do not move that person. Why? You could kill them. You don't know, they may have a broken neck, and you could kill. People have been killed simply who otherwise would have lived if people had let them stay in the car. Car's not on fire. If car's on fire, you get them out, obviously. If they're not breathing, you have to get them out. But if they're breathing, car's not on fire, you leave them and wait for the professionals to get there so they can mobilize the head and neck and so forth, because you could kill a person by moving them. Now, whether you remember that or not in the heat of the moment, I don't know, but in any event. Obviously, this fellow wasn't in a car wreck. We know that. He could have fallen off a camel, a horse, or whatever, but he's paralyzed. He's been that way for 8 years. Evidently, one morning he got up healthy, and by the end of the day, he's bedridden. Been that way for 8 long years. No wheelchairs, no remote control devices, or anything like that. He is simply at the mercy of others. 8 long years. Well, Peter comes up and says, Aeneas, Jesus Christ is making you well. Maketh thee whole, arise and make thy bed. And he arose immediately. The very first miracle that Peter performed was in Acts 3, and that was of a lame man who had been lame from birth. Okay? Now, here's another man who is, well, paralyzed at least, and here is a similar challenge. And right off the bat, Peter says, I want to give credit where credit is due. Who performs this miracle? Jesus does. The power is in Jesus. The power resides in Jesus. It's not in Peter, and he makes that plain. He doesn't say, I'm doing this. He says, Jesus is doing this. And the remarkable thing is, how much does Peter charge? Not a dime, right? Not a penny. No love offering needed here. In contrast to these fakes and phonies today who will make a dime off anybody, he, by the power of Jesus, simply talks to Aeneas, and by talking to him, performs the miracle. There's no evidence that he even touched Aeneas. He simply spoke the words, Jesus makes you well. Get up and make your bed. And Aeneas had to sense something come to his legs. Maybe others had told him to get up years earlier. He knew he couldn't, but now he knows he can rise and he can get up. He has the strength in those legs to get on his feet. And notice also that Peter says, and we may think this a bit unusual, make your bed. That's what Tanya tells me every morning. Make the bed. Make the bed. Well, she doesn't, but why would he say that?
Was to show that he is healed.
Okay, that's right. To make, keep in mind, we're not talking about box springs, frame, mattress up this off the ground. We're talking about, for all practical purposes, a blanket on the ground. That's a bed. That was basically their bed, a blanket on the ground. And the ground usually was dirt or maybe even stone. They didn't have hardwood floors like we have or anything like that. You would be lying on a blanket on the dirt for the most part. So making your bed would mean rolling up your blanket and, getting it out of the way. Your house is small. You don't want to be walking all over that during the day. You're going to make it filthy. So roll it up, get it out of the way. Somebody said the first thing he does every morning is make his bed. Because if you'll do that, you've already accomplished something for that day. Get up, just go ahead and make the bed, and that means you've already accomplished at least one thing that day. Starting the day off right, I guess. That's not a salvation issue, obviously. Your wife may think it is, but we'll leave it at that. So, he gets up immediately, right then, on the spot. No rehab, no physical therapy, no long drawn out healing or so forth. It is immediate, it is complete, it is convincing, and again, it is free. For the first time in 8 years, he stands up. He can look people in the eye. For 8 years, he's been looking at their feet or looking up at them, but now he can stand on his own 2 feet. Don't you know, he walked and ran and jumped and just had a great time knowing that he was fully and completely healed of this paralysis. And now he can go back to work, correct? We're assuming he had a job. Most folks had a job then. And while he was at the mercy of others for 8 years, he's fit now to be back in society working and being productive. Verse 35 says that everybody in the area saw him. They knew him. It wasn't like this fellow's faking this for 8 years. You might fake it for a month. You're not going to fake this for 8 years. Okay? They know he has been paralyzed for 8 years, and so the news spread throughout that region. Those who lived in town, Lydda, they saw the healed man, and they know he is healed. King James uses the word S-A-R-O-N. That's also translated S-A-R-O-N, Sharon. Let me talk to you about Sharon here for a moment. I grew up in the town called Sharon, Tennessee. And if you go to Sharon, Tennessee and pronounce it Sharon, you're probably going to get a good tongue lashing from some of the locals there. It is not Sharon, it is Sharon. Sharon. My mama tried to beat that in my head. It's Sharon. Sharon, long A, Sharon, not Sharon. We were up where Abby and Bryant worship up in Columbia, Tennessee, and met a school teacher there who years ago taught in Sharon, Tennessee, and she said she couldn't remember how many times people corrected her. You pronounce it Sharon. Sharon, Tennessee. Well, to each his own. You can pronounce it Sharon or Sharon. This is actually probably the plain of Sharon. Jesus rose of Sharon. Okay, it's a song that we sometimes sing. When we studied Song of Solomon a couple of years back, we talked about the plain of Sharon in Song of Solomon 2:1 and the wildflowers that grew there. The point is that everybody in that region knew about this healing, and the greatest happening of all was what? The man was healed. Was that the greatest happening? Well, I know. They turned to the Lord. That's the greatest happening. This fella, where's this fella Aeneas today? Still alive? He's been long dead. He may have gotten paralyzed again for all we know, but we know he died. This miracle was to help him temporarily. We're not saying he became paralyzed again, but the primary purpose of the miracle was for what reason?
To convince the people.
To convince the people that Jesus is the Christ. Okay, that Peter is a messenger of God, and they were convinced, no doubt about it. And so the emphasis was the Lord, and the emphasis is this brought people to the Lord. And not everybody perhaps obeyed the gospel, but many of them did. This is another reminder of the fact that good things can come out of bad things. It was a bad thing for Aeneas to be paralyzed, right? But it turned out to be a good thing, correct? These people might never have obeyed the gospel had, first of all, Aeneas never have been paralyzed. We don't see that at the time. I'm sure he didn't see that at the time. But good things can come out of bad things.
It's also interesting there. It says, "And all that dwelt turned to the Lord." You go back over to Lazarus was raised from the dead. It said many that saw this believed. You think that everyone would say that was believed, but they didn't. I mean, that was raised from the dead.
Right.
And I think elsewhere we hear something that it said some believe.
Right.
They see something. People today say, "Well, if I saw that, I know I believe." Well, back then they didn't. I mean, you don't know what you do, or
Right.
you don't understand what their reason was for not believing they saw a man raised from the dead or
Healed.
So they all, turn to the Lord. That would make sense. But why would you not believe in things
Right.
like that? It's hard to imagine.
If this won't convince a person, nothing would, right? If this wouldn't convince a person, nothing would. Good point. Any other thoughts down through 35? All right. Tanya, read verses 36 through 39.
At Joppa there was a certain disciple named Tabitha, which is translated Dorcas. This woman was full of good works and charitable deeds which she did. But it happened in those days that she became sick and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. And since Lydda was near Joppa, and the disciples had heard that Peter was there, they sent 2 men to him, imploring him not to delay in coming to them. And Peter arose and went with them. When he had come, they brought him to the upper room, and all the widows stood by him weeping, showing the tunics and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them.
Okay, back up to verse 36. Again, this now is the town of Joppa. We've been in Lydda. Joppa is about 12 miles west of Lydda. It is right there on the seacoast. It is called Jaffa, Jaffa today, a suburb of Tel Aviv today. When Solomon built the temple, as Adam is teaching us, they cut down cedar trees up there in Tyre and floated them down the seacoast to Joppa. And then they hauled them across land to Jerusalem to build the temple. So now, let's see, what prophet, by the way, ran here? Ran away from the Lord and ran to Joppa and caught a ship? Prophet Nineveh, right? Prophet Jonah. He's supposed to go to Nineveh, but he ran, got a ship there in Joppa, and headed the wrong direction. God changed his direction in a hurry. As in Lydda, there is a congregation established in Joppa, because we read of a disciple there. A disciple is a saint, is a Christian, all synonyms. Her name is Tabitha. This is the second woman named in the book of Acts after Pentecost. The second woman named. Who was the first woman named after Pentecost? Who was the first woman we have her name given after Pentecost? Sapphira. Okay. Sapphira was the first woman named after Pentecost, and now Tabitha or Dorcas is the second. There's a big difference between Tabitha and Sapphira. Tabitha was her Aramaic or Hebrew name. Dorcas would have been her Greek name, much like Saul and Paul. Both names mean gazelle. Gazelle. We all know what a gazelle is, right? Some would argue the most beautiful of the deer family. The most graceful member of the deer family. The gazelle. I think about a moose. I don't think of beauty or grace. Do you? Not as. What is the plural of moose? The plural of goose is geese. Is the plural of moose meese? Doesn't work like that, does it? The plural of mouse is mice. The plural of louse is lice. Is the plural of house heis? Doesn't work like that. But that's why people hate the English language, by the way. There's so many exceptions to the rule. So she's not a moose. She's a gazelle. It gives an idea of what her parents thought of her and her beauty and so forth. Dorcas was a good woman, correct? We would all agree she was a very good woman. How can we say she's a good woman? She did good works. That's exactly right. She didn't have to go around telling people, look what a good woman I am. She demonstrated she was a good person by the works of her life. Alms deeds, King James says, or charitable deeds. She was concerned about people who were hurting, is the idea. And she was full of good works. And she did these. But being a good person does not prevent you from what? Being lost or dying. Being a good person doesn't keep you from dying. She's a good person, but she died. 37. Came to pass in those days that she was sick and she died. We don't know how she became sick. Somebody thought she worked herself to death. I don't buy that. I don't view that as a sickness. But she was no exception to the rule that it is appointed to man once to die, and so she dies. And this is the first person, by the way, the first Christian, the first record of a Christian dying a natural death in the book of Acts. Stephen did not die a natural death, did he? He was stoned to death. Aeneas and Sapphira did not die a natural death. God struck them dead. So if I'm correct, she's the first Christian in Acts to have died, as far as the record is concerned, of dying a natural death. Back in those days, when a person died, usually burial was when? If possible,
Most immediately.
most the same day. Usually the same day. If you could, most the same day. Didn't have what we have today to help preserve a body. She died. She was sick. She died. What did they do next? The body's dead, so why wash the body? Well, they do it today, don't they? You lose a loved one, you're at the hospital, nurses will come by and say, if you'll step out, I'll get your loved one ready, and then you can come in. Okay? Right. There's going to be bodily fluids. When a person dies, there's no control of anything. So there's going to be some cleaning up of the body. So that's true then, true today. So this is out of respect for the family. So they wash the body. And this really puzzles me, and there's no answer for it. Where do they lay her? Upstairs. To me, logically, the place to lay her would be downstairs. You're going to have to lug, we're talking dead weight, a body upstairs. But again, I don't know the layout of the house. I don't know anything about that. Might have been more room upstairs than downstairs for people. There's going to be a crowd of people gathering anyway, so she may have been already upstairs. But, I mean, she's got to come downstairs to be buried, so I don't know. Things that we don't know, and really things that don't matter. But they get news that who's nearby? Peter. Lydda is near Joppa, about 12 miles away. If you walk 3 miles an hour, that's not very fast. It'll take you about 4 hours. If you walk 4 miles an hour, Taking about 3 hours. 4 miles an hour is about a jog. So I don't know. It's a few hours is all it's going to take for them to get from point A to point B. Peter's in the area. Well, if anybody can do anything, surely maybe Peter can. Though we do not have record as of yet of an apostle doing what? Raising the dead. Well, we know Jesus did. But up to now, no apostle, at least there's no record of an apostle raising the dead. But they put two and two together. If Jesus could do it, what? Well, surely maybe Peter can. Won't hurt to have him here anyway. So they send two men forward to go to Peter, imploring him he would not delay to come to them. Some would say, well, what's the rush? She's already dead, but she's not buried yet. That may be part of the urgency here. Are these two men in verse 38 significant men? Somebody say yes and help me out. Yes. They may not have thought they were significant. They could not raise the dead. They couldn't heal the sick, but they had two legs and a mouth, and they could go and get somebody who could help. What do they tell us? Everybody is important. Everybody is important. Okay? Everybody. If those two men did not go and get Peter, Dorcas would never have been raised from the dead. Everybody's important. Verse 39. Peter arose and went with them. He arrived. They brought him to the upper room, and it's packed full of people and packed full of clothes that Dorcas had made. The widows are there weeping. Some want to believe that Dorcas herself was a widow. Well, maybe she was and maybe she wasn't. The text simply does not tell us that. But there, she obviously has friends who are widows, and they are weeping naturally. They've lost a loved one. And they're showing Peter all these garments that Dorcas made, the tunics and the garments. This would be an inner garment, much like men would wear a t-shirt, and an outer garment would be like a coat. So an inner garment and an outer garment, she made those garments, and she sewed, as we would say, for others. My mom sewed just about all her life when she was able. She sewed at a pajama factory in Sharon, Tennessee, many, many years. And she would come home. She had a sewing machine at home, and guess what she did at night? She sewed for the public at night. Back then, whenever you ran a sewing machine or a mixer, it would do what to your TV? All sorts of interference, and we'd get some ad. Can't you wait until some other time to do that sewing or mixing and so forth? But she learned not to pay any attention to us. But she did a lot of sewing in her life. And of course, he had a sewing machine. Dorcas didn't have that advantage. She had a thread and needle and so forth and wool. But she made all kinds of garments for others. Tanya, 40 to 43. We'll wrap this up.
Peter put them all out and knelt down and prayed. And turning to the body, he said, Tabitha, arise. And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. Then he gave her his hand and lifted her up. And when he had called the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. So it was that he stayed many days in Joppa with Simon of Tanner.
All right, thank you. Back to verse 40. Peter tells everybody to what? Step out of the room. He clears the room. Much like when Jesus raised who from the dead? He took Peter, James, and John with him and told everybody else to get out. Who did he raise from the dead? Whose daughter? Jairus' daughter. Okay, so there are a lot of similarities between what Peter does here and what Jesus did in that resurrection. So Peter clears the room. We're not told why. It doesn't matter. He kneels down and prays. His power comes not from him, but from heaven. After prayer, he talks to a lifeless body and calls that lifeless body by name, Tabitha, arise. And when he said that, presto, her life came back into her. She opened her eyes. She saw Peter. She sat up. How long did this take? Just like that, right? Instantaneous. 41, Peter gave her his hand, raised her up. Some say that's redundant language, lifted her up or raised her up. Have you ever raised anything down? Have you ever lifted anything down? A little bit redundant, but again, for emphasis' sake, oftentimes this language is used. Now Peter calls everybody into the room and presents her to them alive. And this was a resurrection from the dead and a genuine miracle. Which of these two miracles was harder for God to do? Healing Aeneas or raising Dorcas? Neither one. When you're omnipotent, everything is easy. Okay? Both were easy. One verse talked about how God healed Aeneas. One verse talked about how God raised Dorcas from the dead. One chapter tells how God made the universe. Just one chapter is all it took. Men would write volumes. God, very succinctly. When you're omnipotent, everything is easy. How much faith did Dorcas have in Peter being able to raise her from the dead?
Well, she was dead and she wouldn't have had any.
No faith, right? She had no faith. If you're dead, you don't have faith. Now, how can we use this to expose fakes today? What do they say if what they intend to happen doesn't happen? Who do they blame?
They say it's your fault, you're on the faith.
If you had enough faith, I could have done it. Well, Dorcas didn't have any faith. She's dead. Okay? He raised her from the dead nonetheless. Okay? And again, the good news of all this is not that anybody's raised from the dead. The good news in all this is what? 42. It was known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. That's the good news. That's the purpose of the miracle. To help people come to know the Lord and obey the Lord. People will ask questions, though, about this. If God could raise Dorcas from the dead, why did he not raise...
Jesus.
He raised Jesus.
I know.
Acts 7.
Oh, Stephen.
Why did he raise Stephen from the dead? Is it that he didn't have the power to do that? What about James? He's going to be killed by the sword in Acts 12. Why raise Dorcas from the dead and leave these others out? And the answer is, we don't know. Other than this is the will of God, and it's not for us to question his will. But the primary purpose of this again was simply to produce faith. What eventually happened to Dorcas? She died. She's not alive today. She died. I don't know if died of what. She's not alive today. So it wasn't to give her perpetual life. It was to show to these people that Peter is God's spokesman. Now, Peter decided to stay in the area, maybe because the church is doing so well, he wants to help them out. So 43, it came to pass that Peter stayed many days in Joppa with a fellow who wore the same name he wore, right? Simon. What does a tanner do? What does a farmer do? What does a school teacher do? Farmer farms, school teacher teaches, so a tanner tans. That's tough, isn't it? A tanner tans. What does he tan? Hides, right? Animal hides. Which is going to be a job that a lot of people, one, don't want. And one reason people do not want that job is that is a smelly, for lack of a better term, job. You're dealing with dead animals, you're dealing with skin, you're dealing with aroma. Many feel that's why his house was close by the sea, because if you live near the sea, what's always blowing? Air, right? Keep those windows open. It's going to get that help with the odor there in the house. Just like we don't want to live near a pig farm, chicken farm, or paper mill, some believe that the tanner's house had to be at least 50 yards away from the nearest house because of the smell involved in that.
Also, the tanner uses a lot of water.
A lot of water, exactly right. Be right there, right, George, right there at his disposal. A whole sea full of water to use, okay? Good point. Peter isn't too good to stay with a tanner, is my point here. He did not feel himself above staying with this aroma and this smell and what some consider to be a detestable job. We are out of time tonight, and Lord willing, next Wednesday we'll start in chapter 10, reading about what man? Cornelius. Cornelius, a Jew or Gentile? Gentile. We'll talk about